There's a pair of silver cars at the top of the pack, and it's been that way for back to back to back to back to back to back seasons. That's 6 in all. The turbo hybrid era has been firmly claimed by Mercedes. In modern Formula 1, it's hard not to equate domination with the silver arrows. Their current string of 6 double championships is unmatched in F1's history. Recently, I asked the subscriber community on YouTube, as I commonly do, the following question: which of these stretches was more dominant by their respective team? And as it turns out, this is something that a lot of you were opinionated about. 9,000 incredible people, incredible F1 fans actually voted for this, and they voted as such. This video, we're going to explore the data and the stories behind the 4 most dominant cars in Formula 1's history. Now, certainly there are going to be other cars and other teams that you deem to be more dominant, but for this video, we're going to focus on the runs that Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, and McLaren had. Let's begin with a comprehensive look at the Mercedes domination over the current turbo hybrid era to get a better understanding of what is actually driving this. After we establish some of the key narratives and some of the pieces of data that we're going to be using across the video, we'll move into the other 3 teams, and ultimately, I'll give you my final conclusion and ranking. So the question is pretty simple. Based on this survey, has Mercedes displayed the most dominant streak in Formula 1? It seems like so much of the conversation about today's Formula 1 is dominated by the fact that Mercedes is, well, winning, and often. So let's have a look at the Mercedes top-line scorecard throughout the turbo hybrid era, and it's as staggering as you can imagine. Mercedes has managed to win 74% of every single Grand Prix they've entered in this era. That's 89 wins of a possible 121. 94 poles. Most importantly, as we'll learn, they have a 1-2 finish rate of 40%. Behind their consistency at the top of the grid has been their stability in drivers. Since this era began, they've only changed their lineup one lone time. But that change is an instrumental factor behind the story in their data. The dominance in the era of Rosberg and Hamilton was even more severe than what you see in the scorecard. Drilling down into the results from 2014 to 2016, we see that they have 51 wins out of a possible 59, which is 86%. A Mercedes driver was on pole 95% of the time. Yes, you are reading that correctly. 56 poles of a possible 59 Grand Prix. And that dwarfs what Valtteri and Lewis have been capable of, which is 61%. Nico and Lewis finished 1-2 53% of the time. And if you think that Valtteri and Lewis are on the podium together a lot, well, that was only 27%. Nico and Lewis nearly doubled it. They also captured 85% of the available points to them, which Hamilton and Valtteri have only taken 77%. The model used in this is going to be leveraging this idea of available points a fair amount, so let's define it very quickly. Available points is an objective measure at looking at how you underperform or outperform your position. And the best way to use this metric is over one full season. Anything less than that, there's not enough data points. So if after a full season, you've finished P1, that means you take the number of races multiplied by the amount of points available to you in that race. That will give you the number of points that was available to you throughout the full season if you performed directly in line with where you finished. Now that seems simple enough, but if you look at, for instance, the champion, if you finished first place in every single race, you will get 100% of those points. But that never happens, right? Lewis doesn't win every race. He'll DNF some, he'll get 3rd, he'll get 4th. And every point that he doesn't finish first is a point left on the table for someone else behind him to pick up. And while it's rare, sometimes you'll see drivers getting over 100% in this metric, which is 100% possible. It just means that the people above them are underperforming, technically. They're leaving stuff on the table. So as we've established, Nico and Lewis were a lot more effective in terms of garnering more points than, say, Valtteri and Lewis were. And continuing with that breakdown, Nico and Lewis were on average 67% clear of the second place team, while Hamilton and Valtteri have only averaged 30% clear comparatively. Drilling down further, we can see that Hamilton's comfortably ahead of Nico across some of these key metrics. In wins, it's 52% versus 34%. Poles, it's 51% Hamilton, 44% Nico. Podiums favor Hamilton 85% to 78%. And looking at, in my opinion, one of the most interesting and important factors, the percent of points captured. It's pretty close, 86% to Hamilton, 85% to Nico. And looking at Hamilton in the past 6 seasons, he's performed very strong on this power metric, never dropping below 70%. And the one time he lost in 2016, the model shows that he was grabbing 101% of available points to him, which makes sense. He's a stronger P2 than what would be predicted. Not only has Mercedes been successful at capturing 1-2 finishes, wins, poles, you name it, they're also very reliable. And this has been one of the major factors into the success of Mercedes throughout the hybrid era. They've retired the car 15 of 121 times. That's not even taken into consideration whether it was incident or mechanical related. Now back to one of the other major headwinds for Mercedes, their 1-2 finishes. As mentioned, Mercedes has finished 1-2 40% of the time in the hybrid era, but broken down further, we see that this is driven overwhelmingly by the years that Nico and Hamilton sprayed champagne together, which was 53% of the time. Of the teams and the eras on this list, there was only one other team in pairing that was able to match this. See if you can guess who it was. As it becomes increasingly more clear, eras are dominated more so by specific drivers rather than teams. The better the pairing, the stronger the team naturally. To illustrate this further, I took the average of the actual points percent by drivers 2 through 5 through all of the hybrid era. And what you'll see, as Nico left, the top 5 drivers, excluding the champion of course, that average of the actual points they took would massively increase. And what this says is the 1-2 finish by Mercedes, those are still happening, but they're not happening nearly as much and it's not as commanding a victory. The top of the field is getting better and better. As the challenging teams continue to improve, Hamilton's improvements are marginal, but they're there. He is having an upward trend of his success and his ability to score on these key metrics. Since his loss in 2016, he's elevated his win percent to 52% from 45% in 2017. Now there was an element of 2019 that played out that serves as a major caveat to all this and what to watch for, and that's the dwindling advantage that Mercedes had for getting their poles. I believe that this is actually a leading indicator to shifting dynamics. The trend clearly is moving away from Mercedes. Eventually, these teams will do a better job of converting these poles into wins. Even the Mercedes win pattern follows this declining trend, with one major deviation seen in 2018, a spike stemming from the missed opportunities from other top teams, namely Ferrari. While I do feel that Mercedes benefits from a fair bit of recency bias, I think it's rooted in an underlying narrative that's factually accurate, statistically speaking. Mercedes has the most races of uninterrupted championship seasons than any team in any other spell in Formula 1. Mercedes has the most net wins, poles, and 1-2 finishes. All of that is with respect to the actual time period of the era in question. Even with that impressive scorecard, Mercedes had a couple advantages that other teams didn't. The controllable component was recruiting 2 of the best available drivers. As has been proven through the data, much of the driving factor that sets Mercedes apart were the contributions of a driver like Rosberg from 2014 to 2016. Let's switch gears and go to the next team that was voted, which is Ferrari 2000 to 2004. By the numbers, Ferrari had a very impressive run of their own, taking 67% of wins, 59% of poles, and 71% of points available to them. Where Ferrari would be stronger than Mercedes is their margin of victory over the second place team on the grid. In those 5 years, Ferrari would score as a team 990 points compared to the second place finisher in each respective year, which was an aggregate 609 points. This puts a Scuderia at 63% better. Compare this to Mercedes, who finished 46% better than the second place finisher on the grid. Before we actually start talking about Ferrari and their numbers, let's get a bit of context, and I'll tell you a little bit about the story of how Ferrari entered the turn of the century and where we are on that timeline. Ferrari entered the 2000 season with a recovered Schumacher who suffered a broken leg and was forced to sit out 9 consecutive rounds at the end of the 99 season. Returning with just 2 races to go, he helped the team grab their first constructors win since the double of Jody Scheckter in 1979. The 2000 season saw the Ferrari Dream Team well intact. Jean Todt and Ross Brawn at the head, with Rory Byrne set to design the F2000 with Aldo Costa working directly under him. Michael would be matched with Rubens Barrichello as Eddie Irvine went to the newly branded Jaguar team in what amounted to basically a driver swap. The aero in the F2000 saw significant improvements and would rival Adrian Newey's MP415. The Häkkinen and Schumacher battle was again well underway, picking right up where it seemingly left off. While Michael secured the early wins of the season, Mika Häkkinen came back, winning Hungary and Belgium on the heels of Michael's lost points in the rounds of 9, 10, and then his home race in Germany, round 11. And to me, this was one of the more memorable Michael moments. As the team was entering their home race in Italy, Michael had found himself 2 points down after Mika had taken victories in the previous 2 rounds. Schumacher responded with 4 wins and 4 poles in the last 4 Grand Prix. This would ultimately put Schumacher 19 points clear of Mika Häkkinen, who only saw the podium twice in those final 4 rounds after he had just won 3 of the previous 4. And here is where the double championships would start, and their dominance would also start. They took both of the titles from 2000 to 2004. The car from the 2001 season was just better designed, and it showed. Schumacher would either win, place runner-up, or just not finish in every single race aside from 1. The car was much more reliable, winning 9 of 17 races, and Ferrari took 11 poles. With no clear challenger that year and young drivers seeing the grid for the first time, Mike was setting up an uninterrupted spree of annihilating the competition. And while the grid saw the debut of Juan Pablo Montoya, Fernando Alonso, and Kimi Räikkönen, they were hardly a problem, yet. Michael's 58-point margin and Ferrari's 77-point lead from the 2001 season would be great momentum going into the 2002 season. The other notable wins that year were shared between Ralf Schumacher and Juan Pablo Montoya of Williams. 4 victories they saw that year marked a return of Williams in 2001 and proved their BMW engines were arguably the most powerful on the grid. But the challengers were still a year out from mounting anything substantial. 2002 would be a masterclass of driving and peak performance of a car. Aside from some controversy, which will be covered separately, Schumacher had nearly a perfect season, finishing every race and earned podium honors in every single Grand Prix. While Michael was clearly getting more out of the car, nearly doubling Barrichello, the Brazilian would still finish 27 points ahead of Montoya. Ferrari would win 15 of 17 races that year, or 88%. Schumacher's win rate was a stellar 65% alone that season. An interesting data point emerged though, and even with Ferrari's 221 points, which was more than the rest of the constructors combined, they still only managed 9 1-2 finishes. To put this in perspective, Mercedes achieved a better 1-2 finish rate in both 2014 and 2015, ending in 58% and 63% respectively. Despite the drivers pulling in 140% more than their nearest competitor, their performance captured 81% of points available to them. This feat would be matched by Mercedes in both 2018 and 2019. Further, it was beaten in 2014, 15, and 2016 by Mercedes. But Michael individually captured 85% of the points available to him in P1. Unsurprisingly, that's one of the highest statistical success rates we've seen in Formula One history. The Ferrari reign was really only interrupted by one major challenge, and that was by Kimi and Montoya in 2003. 2003 would be the season that Ferrari and Michael's points captured rate would be the lowest it dips throughout the entire era. Ferrari would win nearly half the races they did in 2002, taking top spot 8 times in the 2003 season. They would clear the runner-up McLaren by just 10%, with Michael barely holding off the Finn. And no, not Mika Häkkinen this time. Now he's battling a young future world champion, Kimi Räikkönen. Both Räikkönen and the Williams driver Montoya had some ill-timed reliability issues that left them unable to keep pace with Michael. He'd go on to edge Kimi by 2 points and Juan Pablo Montoya by 11. But it went as easy as it came, and 2004 would be another failed design from both Williams and McLaren. The Williams team would experiment with heads wall where snow's design, only to abandon it. McLaren would ultimately pick back up the work on the MP418, which was originally slated to be driven in 2003 as a genuine contender with quote-unquote radical changes made. But after failing testing, it was never driven, and the team went on with a highly developed version of the previous year's car. Mike Coughlin from Arrows and Adrian Newey transitioned this research into the design of the MP419, which would be driven in 2004. They were plagued by unreliability, and both teams would fail to put up a real fight that year. And while 2002 is heralded as one of the best single performances by a driver, 2004 saw Michael winning 13 races at an impressive 72% rate and were significantly higher than Barrichello's 2 wins in Italy and China. Despite reliability being much better, only failing to finish 11% of the races and beating runner-up BAR by 120%, they would capture 81% of the points as a team. Over those seasons, a Ferrari failed to finish 19% of the Grand Prix. This compares to 12% of Mercedes. And the difference between that 19% and 12%, that's not quite negligible. This wasn't really the driving factor behind why the team, at least statistically speaking, wasn't as dominant as Mercedes. More the detractors were in the driver pairing, as Michael clearly was able to maximize the car and extract the points. Ferrari failed to finish in the second position in the Drivers' Championship more times than not with Barrichello. Over this era, he would earn a pair of runner-ups. He would get P3 and 2 P4s. Needless to say, their 1-2 finish rate was significantly lower than that of Mercedes in the turbo hybrid era, which was 27% for Ferrari versus 40% for Mercedes. Given the persistent changes to aero regulations, teams were constantly adapting aero setups and tweaking designs. It is my opinion that this led to a field that didn't always have their best foot forward. But this is also evident and proven in the data, as Ferrari had some of the highest margins of victory as a percent of points clear in P2 in the constructors, while simultaneously they saw lower levels of percent available points taken compared to Mercedes. But there was a team who had a 1-2 lineup that was better than any team in history we've ever seen. That, of course, was the McLaren lineup of Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost. If you think today's Formula One is dominated by one team, you must have forgotten about the 1988 and 1989 season. 88 was especially dominant, and they would have won every single Grand Prix had Ayrton not tripped over a backmarker in Italy. In a car I rank marginally behind the all-powerful FW14B, the MP44 was a legendary piece of machinery, especially at the hands of its operators, and had the results to prove it. In 1988, across 16 Grand Prix, there were 15 wins, 15 poles, 10 1-2 finishes, or 63%, and McLaren earned 83% of the points available to them. They would go on to beat the second place team by 206%, and their 1-2 finish rate was matched only by Mercedes of the 2015 season. And interestingly, this was the most number of races that McLaren would finish by a large margin, completing about a fifth of those Grand Prix. Most of us know the story of what happened next, but in 1989, the hostility picked up tremendously. Despite this, they'd still go on to dominate that season, but the retirements from mechanical and collision would increase from 19% all the way up to 56%. The switch from tag engines made upon the arrival of Ayrton in 1988 over to Honda would remain steady, as Prost would leave the team after the 1989 Japan Grand Prix controversy. He would then go on to drive for Ferrari. That 1988 season was the last time that turbo engines were to be used. Ron Dennis made the call to design the car around it anyway. Of the remaining engines to not shift towards natural aspiration, which was an impending FIA regulation to take place in 1989, McLaren's V6 turbo was among the most powerful and shared only by the Lotus team. His recent departure from Williams was as a result of Frank Williams choosing Nigel Mansell and not capitulating to Honda's desire to see Nakajima in that second seat. This left a team who had won 50% of the Constructors' Championship that decade without an engine and a fractured driver situation. Williams would retire the car 20 times and have a sharp decline in form, going from Constructors' Champions all the way to 7th place with 20 points. The 89 season would be relatively unchallenged despite Williams securing a much more powerful engine in the Renault RS1s. While they'd go on to create a very dominant car around this power, their first year still left room to improve as they had lost Mansell, who went to Ferrari. The Scuderia 640 failed to mount a strong challenge to McLaren's MP45. It was down on power and rolled out the revolutionary Formula One sequential gearbox, the first of its kind. Though it was game-changing, it was new, and the kinks were being worked out. They would retire or be disqualified 66% of the time that season. 1990 was a different story, as Mansell would be joined by Prost and give Ayrton a real fight for the title. But yet again, Senna would walk away the victor after another controversial title decider in Japan, with Prost no less. 1991 would start to swing back to Williams, as Adrian Newey seemed to have designed a winner in the FW14. Senna would ultimately take his final title, battling with Nigel Mansell, who reunited with Frank Williams for his 1991 season. Ferrari seemed to be going backwards, and Alain Prost had a falling out, splitting with Scuderia for publicly criticizing the 643, having failed to win a single Grand Prix that season. Never has the theme played out so clearly that the most dominant eras are a perfect blend of equal parts car, driver pairing, and the right competitive landscape. The period from 1988 to 1991 was just as the engine regulations made a massive shift away from the turbos, which wouldn't appear again until 2014 in this current turbo hybrid era. A switch that Honda was prepared for, and they were able to produce strong power across the change. But not everyone was as prepared for this change, and some teams were caught out. McLaren was able to capitalize on the situation and control the grid. After turbos were banned and Prost went to Ferrari, McLaren would only win the 1990 and 1991 Constructors' Championships by 10% and 11% respectively. The pairing of Senna and Berger was significantly weaker, as the two would only produce 3 1-2 finishes of a possible 32 races, and in the final 2 seasons of this dominant stretch by McLaren, Berger would place P4 in both seasons until ultimately Williams took back the Constructors' title in 1992. McLaren as a team would continue their steady trend down from that dominant 1988 season in terms of taking available points. The final 2 Constructors' titles were driven by Ayrton almost exclusively. He had an exceptional average pole capture rate of 69%, and over the course of his entire reign at McLaren, he would take 42% of victories in those Grand Prix, and he would take 3 out of those 4 drivers' titles. Similar to Nico and Lewis in 2014 through 2016, the 1988 battle was a good reminder that having 2 number 1 drivers, while they may come together, it certainly still pushed both drivers to be better, and it would ultimately be better for the team. That year, Prost did finish P2, but he clinched 91% of points available to him. What's often neglected when you talk about 1988 is the fact that Prost failed to finish twice, and of the times where he did finish, he never finished worse than P2. He did have opportunities to win that season though. Ayrton would only capture 63% of the points available to him due to 3 finishes off the podium, 1 out of the points, and 1 DQ at his home race in the opening round. Only the best 11 finishes counted towards your total, so this would actually be one of the rare seasons where the winner had fewer points than anyone else in the field, as Prost had 105 points over 16 races. Ayrton had 95 over 16 races. And while McLaren is the quintessential example of F1 dominance, winning by large margins, it doesn't always look the same. Let's take a look at a title run that was much more modest at times and had many more down-to-the-wire fights. For some reason, calling Red Bull's performance from 2010 to 2013 dominant is controversial. But that seems hardly so, and I want to look at the data to prove that. Winning 4 times in a row when 6 champions graced the grid is without a doubt a very strong performance. Red Bull's margins were significantly lower, yes, but I think anyone would accept the reality that the grid was full of strong drivers, and as engines got better and better, the performance margins began to dissipate. The Red Bull with Adrian Newey at the helm designed winners in the RB6 through the RB9. At times, the team struggled significantly with an alternator problem so bad, Newey himself called it a ticking time bomb. Rather than cover it here, if you'd like to see the season action, you can find the 2010 and 2012 full season reviews in the top right corner, or down in the description below. In this entire analysis across all of the teams and eras, this Red Bull team would be the only constructor having a pairing where the second driver never actually finished in P2 in the Drivers' Championship. As such, they'd also have the least amount of wins and lowest win rate of any string of constructors titles of any of these 4 teams. Their run from 2010 to 2013 produced 41 wins, which is 53%, 52 poles, which is 68%, and 12 1-2 finishes, which is just a lowly 16%. Now, as we step back and try to measure Red Bull objectively, the interesting part to look at is the points clear from the next place team. Aside from 2013, Red Bull seemed to max out at 31% in terms of gap to nearest competitor on points. They also still managed to keep a solid percent of points taken in the top slot, averaging 67%. That's just 6 points below Ferrari, but 14 points below Mercedes. Now, if you're wondering how to measure the competitive field, well, you can just look at the data. Starting with 2011, Red Bull took 80% of the points available to them, an incredibly high number for the champion team to take. But they were only 31% better on points than the second place team. To put that in perspective, Ferrari took 81% of points available to them, but they were 140% clear to the next place team on the grid. McLaren in 1988 took 83% of the points available to them, steering them 206 points clear of P2. To better understand the source of why Red Bull's reign seemed quote-unquote less dominant to many, let's break out the team data by driver. In those 4 years, Red Bull won 41 races, with 34 of them going to Sebastian, or 83% of the team's total wins, while Webber won 7 Grand Prix for 17%. Vettel would be on the podium 69% of the time during those years versus Webber's 42%. Seb would also take 40 of the team's 52 poles, which is 77%. Compare that to Webber's 12 poles, which would account for the remaining 23%. 2010 and 2012 were some of the largest detractors to Red Bull's overall performance during their reign. In that final 2013 season before the regulation change, Red Bull would notch 13 Grand Prix victories, all of them going to Sebastian. They would earn 24 podiums, but just earn 4 1-2 finishes. As mentioned, their struggles to really separate as a constructor rested with the stark contrast in results between the driver pairing. Here are the 3 main factors and inputs that I've used when measuring these teams: competition, drivers, and car. In 4th place, we have Red Bull. One of the main factors was, of the 4 teams included in this analysis, Red Bull had the weakest pairing performance. This is where the McLaren and the Red Bull storylines converge. But on top of that, the car had some major problems that lasted large lengths of some of those seasons. But when that car came together, for the entirety of the 2013 season for instance, or in 2012 during the Asia stretch, it was unbeatable, especially over 1 lap. I am factoring in it was a tough era for regulations, but they still should have been able to produce a more reliable car. That said, Seb still managing to win 4 titles is incredibly impressive, especially when you break out the data to measure his results individually. If they had successfully produced more 1-2 finishes, they'd be ranked higher, but Webber not winning a single race in 2013, this was a pretty large drawback to their performance overall. And 3rd, we have McLaren. Had Prost stayed, this would have without a doubt been the most complete era and reign in F1 history. But the fact that he did switch and we did see something similar happen at Red Bull as mentioned, this cemented their place here. What was also heavily considered was the flux in engine regulations throughout the middle of this era. McLaren did have a very powerful car, there's no doubt about that. It was a good strategic decision getting Honda as their partner, but they were also facing teams who were often scrambling to find solution to engine changes or to work out their aero packages. That said, failing to get a single 1-2 finish in 1990 and Ayrton accounting for 13 of the final 14 wins across 1990 and 1991 really did weaken their ultimate position in this ranking. But similar to every other driver on this list that dominated the era, the individual performance of the winning driver was especially impressive. I agonized over these final 2, but ultimately I came to a conclusion, and in 2nd, I have Ferrari. Ferrari was an interesting one to rate because I don't fully believe that Ferrari always had the best car. This does factor into the constructor ranking. Ferrari's car performance across their dominance comes in behind the relative performance of the MP44. This is reflected in their driver performance, which has dropped to an 8, as the second driver scored P3 or worse in more than half of the 5 seasons. The individual performance of Michael is really what kept them taking the Constructors' Championship throughout this stretch. It's worth noting that he has the best win percent of any single driver on this list across their most dominant spells at 52.75%. If you compare this to the rest of the drivers, you have Hamilton coming slightly behind him with 51.24%, Vettel at 44.16%, and Ayrton Senna at 42.19%. As such, I would rate Michael Schumacher's performance during this time period as the strongest, albeit by a very small margin, over Hamilton's 2014 to 2019 performance. And finally, we have Mercedes in first position. It has to be Mercedes. I took a two-pronged approach while making this consideration. Number one, their driver pairing from 2014 and 2016, as mentioned, set the tone for the era. Number two, and this is by far one of the commanding reasons why they're here, they have an overwhelmingly strong car, the best car in the grid bar none. Now when you break out the performances and the data, with the entrance of Valtteri, things fell back in line with the rest of the teams, and in some cases, they were even lower than some of the other teams. But they're being considered across the entire era. Earlier in this era, the competition was weaker, going through much of the woes seen in the 1989 technical changes. And similar to McLaren, Mercedes is being rewarded for being prepared for this. As we approach the end of the era and the end of the decade, competition has gotten better and better. Not quite to the level of a decade ago, say during Sebastian Vettel's reign, but teams are able to battle Mercedes. But two things can be true at once, and it just so has it that Hamilton has continued to improve and offset these competitive gains. Valtteri's switch wasn't the most smooth in his 2018 performance, especially where he failed to win a Grand Prix and finish off the podium in more than half of the races. This didn't really help them in the driver ranking, but they still found a way to win. Their consistency across the years able to produce by far the most 1-2 finishes of any team on this list. On top of that, their dominant power unit chassis integration, this is what puts them as the most dominant era in F1 history. The teams analyzed in this video accomplished 226 wins across 347 races. No matter what history says or how you rate them, how I rate them, their name is still on that trophy. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe and I'll bring you more F1 stories and analysis. Leave feedback in the comments, and if you have a video suggestion, leave it in the video suggestion forum, as well as vote other topics that you're interested in. You can find that link below as well. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you all very, very soon.